She didn't go to the church looking for miracles. She went because silence was the only place where her thoughts didn't scream back at her. Evelyn Marrow stepped inside St. Brigid's that night, expecting nothing more than cold wooden pews, the faint smell of old incense, and a moment to breathe. But the church wasn't empty. At least, it didn't feel empty. A voice was waiting for her, gentle, steady, impossibly familiar, and it spoke her name before she ever whispered a word. People say faith moves quietly, that it never announces itself, that when it shows up it does so in the softest ways, an echo, a presence, a warmth you can't explain. But what happens when faith appears in a form you were told no longer exists? What happens when a confession is answered by someone who shouldn't be there, someone who hasn't been part of the living clergy for decades? Evelyn's confession began like anyone else's. Hesitating breaths, a trembling heart, a secret carried too long. But as she spoke, the voice behind the screen didn't judge, it didn't rush, it didn't sound like a man fulfilling a duty, but like someone who had been waiting, specifically for her. And when he said, "You're not alone," something inside her broke, softly, the way an old door opens after years of being stuck. The next morning, she would learn the impossible truth. No priest had been scheduled, no clergy were present, no confession logs existed. And the voice she heard matched a man who'd been gone for nearly 20 years, yet the words he gave her stayed. They settled into her life like a quiet lantern in a place she thought would never hold light again. This is not a story about fear. It's a story about what happens when grace arrives in a form you weren't prepared to receive. For most of her life, Evelyn carried her faith like a folded letter, kept close, rarely opened, often forgotten until the weight of it pressed against her heart. She wasn't the type to wander into churches at night, nor the type to chase after signs or wonder if heaven still paid attention to people like her. But grief has a way of bending a person's steps, guiding them toward quiet places when the world becomes too loud. And on that cold November evening, the quiet drew her in. St. Brigid stood alone on the corner of Harper Avenue, its stone walls washed pale by the moonlight, its arched windows reflecting the remnants of a day already forgotten. The doors should have been locked. The lights should have been off. Yet something compelled her forward, a pull she couldn't name, a softness in her chest that didn't feel like fear. When she crossed the threshold, the air changed. Cooler, yet strangely comforting, as if someone had exhaled just moments before she arrived. She took a seat in the back pew, hoping the silence would steady her. Instead it deepened, thickening with a presence she couldn't explain. The confessional booth stood open, a single light glowing above it, a light no one had turned on. She approached it slowly, not out of superstition, but because something inside her whispered that she was meant to. When the voice answered her, calm, tender, unmistakably real, every part of her stilled. It wasn't the tone that shook her. It was the warmth beneath it, a warmth she hadn't felt from anyone in years, and as she began to speak, the church seemed to close around her like a shelter, holding her confession in a place where time itself felt suspended. Whatever waited beyond that screen wasn't duty. It was something else, something older, something that knew her. The November wind pushed against the old wooden doors of St. Brigid's as Evelyn Marrow stepped inside, pulling the cold in with her. The moment the heavy door closed behind her, the outside world softened into a distant hum. Inside the sanctuary, the air trembled with a faint scent of extinguished candles and the lingering trace of incense that had seeped into the stone over decades. It was a silence layered not in emptiness, but in memory, soft, weighty, almost warm. She paused near the entrance, waiting for her eyes to adjust, unsure why the dim amber light inside felt different that night, as though it belonged to a place suspended just slightly outside time. She didn't come for confession. Not really. She came because something inside her refused to sit quietly anymore. A heaviness she could no longer reason with. A guilt she had carried so long it had become a shape inside her chest. Therapy hadn't reached it. Prayer hadn't pierced it. And people never got close enough to see it. Tonight wasn't about ritual. It was about breathing somewhere her pain wouldn't echo back as loudly. But as she walked slowly between the pews, fingers brushing the rough varnish of the last row, she felt it again, the inexplicable pull toward the confessional booth glowing faintly on the right side of the sanctuary. That light shouldn't have been on. She knew the parish schedule by heart. Confessions ended at 5, and the last on-duty priest left by 7:30. It was nearly 9, yet the small lamp above the confessional door flickered softly, like a quiet invitation, or a warning, she didn't know which. She stood in front of the booth for nearly a full minute, hearing nothing but her own breath and the settling sounds of the old church, the ticking of the wall-mounted heater, the faint creak of the wooden floorboards under their own weight, the whisper of cold air against stained glass. Her hand hovered over the curtain, hesitating not from fear, but from the strange certainty that once she stepped inside, something in her life would shift. Not dramatically, not violently, but with the slow force of something long overdue. She pulled the curtain aside and slipped into the small, dark enclosure, the wooden door closing with a soft groan behind her. The bench was older than she remembered, its surface polished smooth by decades of weary bodies. She sat, exhaling slowly. The opposite screen remained closed, its cross-pattern lattice faintly illuminated by the thin line of light coming from the lamp above. She wasn't expecting anyone. She wasn't expecting an answer. Then she heard it, a breath, not hers. "Good evening," a voice said through the screen, low, gentle, the kind of voice that settled somewhere deep rather than merely entering the ears. Its cadence was slow, almost patient. She froze, unsure if she imagined it. But the voice continued, calm and unmistakably present. "Whenever you're ready, child." Child. No one had called her that in years. Her heart knocked once against her ribs, sharp and sudden. She swallowed, trying to steady her breath. She hadn't prepared anything to say. She didn't even know what secret she intended to confess. But the moment the voice filled the booth, words she thought she had buried began rising to the surface, unsteady, painful, uninvited. I wasn't expecting anyone to be here," she said quietly. "I know," the voice replied. Something in the tone, its warmth, its certainty, made her eyes sting. She pressed her fingers against her palms, grounding herself. "I didn't come here for confession." "Not really." "Then perhaps confession came for you," he said softly. The air tightened for a moment, as if the booth itself inhaled with her. She felt her throat constrict, a familiar ache blooming beneath her sternum. She had been trying to outrun this ache for months, maybe for years. But something about the way he spoke, steady, unhurried, without assuming anything from her, pulled the truth closer to her lips. She exhaled slowly, her breath trembling. "I've been carrying something for a long time. Something I never said out loud." Silence followed, not empty, not expectant, but deeply attentive. She could almost imagine a presence leaning closer, not intruding, but waiting with genuine patience. "You can speak freely," he murmured. "Nothing you say tonight will meet judgment, only understanding." Her eyes brimmed, the pressure behind them finally giving way. It wasn't the words that broke her. It was the kindness in his tone, kindness given without context, without reasoning, without knowing who she was or what she had done. It was a rare thing to be met with care before confession, almost impossible. "It's about my sister," she whispered. The moment the words left her, a subtle shift passed through her chest, like a locked door giving way. "She died 2 years ago," Evelyn continued, and I wasn't there. She asked me to visit. I made excuses, work, exhaustion, my own life falling apart. I told myself she would be fine till the weekend." Her voice cracked. She wasn't. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It held her. It steadied her. "You're carrying a weight that wasn't placed on you," the voice finally said. "Grief invents stories. It tells us we are responsible for things we could not have changed." Her breath trembled again. "But I should have gone." "You loved her," he said gently. "And love does not vanish because you weren't present at a final moment. Love is measured across years, not hours." Her tears fell silently, tracing the curve of her jaw before dropping onto her hands. "How do you know that?" she asked, voice barely audible. The priest paused, and for a moment the booth felt impossibly still. When he finally spoke, his words entered the room with a warmth that seemed older than the walls themselves. "Because love like yours doesn't end at a bedside," he whispered. "It lingers. It waits. It finds its way." A shiver moved down her spine, not fear, but recognition. Something in his tone felt too specific, too certain, too personal, as if he saw something deeper in her than she had shown. "Evelyn," he said softly. She lifted her head sharply. She had never told him her name. Before she could speak, the small wooden slats of the screen shifted as though a faint breeze had passed through, and the lamp above flickered once, dimming the booth in a soft wave of shadow. Her pulse quickened, her breath tightening. "How do you—" she began. But the booth had already fallen into silence, a silence too complete to make sense, a silence that felt empty, as if no one had ever been there. Morning light rarely felt harsh in November, but that day it struck Evelyn like a wake-up call she wasn't ready to hear. She had slept poorly, waking from fragmented dreams she couldn't recall fully, only impressions, like the echo of a voice and the faint scent of incense. When she finally sat on the edge of her bed, the memory of the previous night returned with a clarity that didn't feel like memory at all. It felt lived, present, as if the words spoken in that confessional still hovered in the air around her. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to ground herself. She could almost hear him again, the gentleness of his reassurance, the way he said her name without hesitation, the pause before he spoke truth she hadn't dared admit to herself. None of it made sense, and yet not one part of it felt like imagination, not one part felt invented by grief. There had been someone there, someone who listened, someone who spoke to her with a familiarity no stranger should possess. But the booth had been empty when she opened the door. She replayed the moment again, the sudden silence, the absence of breath, the fading warmth that had pressed through the screen moments earlier. She didn't believe in ghosts. She didn't chase miracles. She wasn't fragile or suggestible. She was grounded, logical, a woman who trusted reason above emotion for most of her adult life, and yet she needed answers. St. Brigid's parish office opened at 9. By 8:30, Evelyn was already parked outside, the engine off, her fingers gripping the steering wheel more tightly than she intended. Frost clung to the edges of the windshield, and the morning air was sharp enough to fog with each breath. She watched the small entrance door, framed by brick arches, waiting for someone, anyone, to arrive and unlock it. At 8:55, she saw movement inside. A figure crossed the hallway, a woman in her 50s wearing a navy cardigan, keys in hand. Evelyn stepped out of her car, her heart thudding with a strange mix of urgency and unease. The door opened, and the woman smiled politely. "Good morning. Can I help you?" I hope so," Evelyn said. "I was here last night, in the sanctuary." The woman raised her brows slightly. "Last night? The church closes at 8. Were you at Mass?" "No." Evelyn hesitated. "I came in after hours. I thought the doors would be locked, but they weren't. The secretary's smile faded into concern. They weren't? That's unusual. Evelyn nodded slowly, and the confessional light was on. Now the woman frowned. It shouldn't have been. I know, Evelyn inhaled. That's why I'm here. I need to know who was hearing confessions. The secretary blinked. No one. Confessions ended at 5, and Father Jonathan left at 7:30. There's no one scheduled afterward, ever. The words settled over Evelyn like a drop in pressure. But someone was there. Someone spoke to me. The woman's confusion deepened. She gestured gently. Come in. Let's check the roster. The parish office smelled faintly of paper and lemon cleaner. A bulletin board filled one wall, covered in schedules, ministry rotations, and service updates. The woman opened a binder labeled Clergy Duty Roster, flipping through neatly organized pages filled with times, initials, and signatures. There, she said, pointing. Last night, Father Jonathan for evening mass. He signed out at 7:28 p.m. The signature was clean, unmistakable. And after that, Evelyn pressed, no clergy assigned. The woman looked up. There was absolutely no priest in the building after 8. A hush settled between them. Could someone have come in without signing the register? Evelyn asked. The woman shook her head. Priests are required to log every unscheduled confession, emergencies, drop-ins, everything. It's a diocesan protocol. She paused. And the alarm is set at 8:15. No one can enter after that except staff with keys. Evelyn felt the room tighten around her. But I spoke to someone. He listened. He answered. He said my name. The secretary exhaled slowly, studying her face with a more careful expression, not dismissive, not skeptical, concerned, curious. What did he sound like? She asked softly. Older. Warm, calm. His voice had, she searched for the right word. An accent, Irish maybe. A subtle shift crossed the woman's features, something like recognition or memory. She stood up. Wait here. Evelyn's pulse flickered faster as the secretary disappeared into the hallway, her footsteps fading behind a partially closed door. For several seconds, Evelyn heard nothing. Then the soft metallic click of a drawer, papers being moved, the gentle thud of a file placed onto a desk. When the woman returned, she carried a thin, cream-colored folder with the seal of the diocese pressed across the corner. She set it on the counter between them. This, she said quietly, is a list of priests who served at St. Brigid's long before Father Jonathan. Evelyn's breath caught as the folder opened to reveal a series of black and white photographs. Some faces were young, some stern, some kind-eyed. The names were typed neatly beneath each image, the years of service listed beside them. The secretary turned a few pages, stopped, then rotated the folder toward Evelyn. Is this the man you spoke to? The moment Evelyn saw the photo, a deep tremor passed through her. The face staring back at her was unmistakable, soft lines around the eyes, a gentle, down-turned mouth, a presence that felt familiar even through a faded picture. Yes, Evelyn whispered, that's him. The secretary swallowed. That's Father Declan O'Rourke. He served here for 27 years. Evelyn felt her heartbeat stutter. Where is he now? The woman lowered her gaze before answering. He died in 2004. Evelyn's fingers curled against the counter. The static hum of the office lights grew louder. The faint ticking of a wall clock punctuated the silence. She waited for the woman to take the words back, to laugh, to offer some logical explanation that would erase the growing tension under her skin. Instead, the secretary spoke more quietly. You're not the first person who's asked about him. A chill passed through the room, subtle yet unmistakable. What do you mean? Evelyn asked. The woman hesitated. Over the years, a few parishioners have mentioned hearing a voice in the confessional during late hours, a voice that doesn't match anyone currently serving. Evelyn's breath faltered. And no one looked into it? Oh, they did, the woman said. But the diocese dismissed the reports. They chalked it up to grief, memory, or imagination. She paused. Father Declan was deeply loved here. Some people cling to voices they miss. I wasn't imagining it, Evelyn said, her voice sharper than intended. I don't think you were, the woman replied quietly. Another silence, not uncomfortable, heavy, knowing. Evelyn closed the folder, her fingers lingering on the cover. Something inside her shifted, an uneasiness mixed with an undeniable sense of being seen, heard, sought out. She took a step back, her breath unsteady. I need to think. The secretary nodded gently. If you remember anything else, come back. Some stories aren't meant to be carried alone. As Evelyn stepped outside, the cold air hit her like a sudden gust, sharper than before. She inhaled deeply, letting the chill steady her thoughts. She had come seeking answers, but what she found opened a deeper question, one she wasn't prepared to face. If Father Declan died 20 years ago, who or what had spoken her name last night? And why did it feel less like a haunting and more like a calling? The cold stayed with her long after she left the parish office, as though the wind that hit her outside had followed her home, lingering in the spaces between her thoughts. Evelyn drove in silence, the road unfolding beneath her tires, without registering fully in her mind. She kept replaying the image of Father Declan O'Rourke, the soft eyes, the slight tilt of his mouth, the presence that somehow matched the man she'd spoken to behind the screen. But the most unsettling part wasn't the resemblance. It was the familiarity, the way something in her chest recognized him before her mind did. She reached her apartment and sat inside the parked car for several minutes, numb to the hum of the engine cooling. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, her pulse steady but deep, as if echoing from a place she rarely touched. She closed her eyes, but the darkness only amplified the memory of the previous night. The sound of his voice, the calm certainty, the moment he said her name. She hadn't misheard, she hadn't imagined it. Something had happened in that booth that defied routine, logic, and the neat structure she used to keep her life in order. When she finally stepped inside her apartment, she noticed how different the silence felt compared to the church. Here, it was hollow, thin, devoid of weight. The space looked exactly as she'd left it. Clean surfaces, muted colors, framed photos on the wall, but everything felt distant, like a room she was renting temporarily from her own life. She walked toward the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and held it with both hands, grounding herself in the temperature against her skin. She set the glass down, then retrieved the small wooden keepsake box she kept in her bedroom closet. She hadn't opened it in a long time. Inside were the fragments of a life she'd carefully avoided confronting. Letters from her sister, photographs from years before everything fell apart, unfinished apologies she never sent. She sifted through them one by one, her fingers brushing over dates that now felt like markers of a past she'd abandoned. Near the bottom of the box, she found a folded program from a memorial service, her sister's name printed across the top, the date still familiar enough to tighten her throat. She swallowed hard and closed the box, the ache pressing against her ribs. She wasn't looking for comfort. She wasn't seeking closure. She was trying to understand why the voice from the night before had struck so deeply, touching a part of her grief she thought no longer had words. Later that afternoon, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, studying her reflection. She expected to find exhaustion in the sharp lines beneath her eyes, but what she saw instead was something else, something unfamiliar. the faint glow of someone who'd heard truth spoken in a way that pierced through denial. Her chest tightened. She didn't know if she was imagining that too, or if something in her really shifted the moment Father Declan spoke to her. She left the bathroom and grabbed her coat. She needed air, movement, distance. She walked for nearly an hour through her neighborhood, past bare trees and quiet houses preparing for winter. The sky dimmed early, as November often did, settling into cool shades of blue and silver. Street lamps flickered on one by one, their halos softening the streets in a way that reminded her of church candlelight. As she passed an old corner bookstore, she paused. The shop windows were filled with used books stacked unevenly, small lamps casting golden pools of light inside. Something about the warmth of that glow drew her in. She stepped inside, greeted by the soft chiming of the bell above the door. The scent of aging paper and dust mingled with the faint aroma of brewed tea. A man behind the counter, thin, grey-haired, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, glanced up and offered a gentle nod. "Looking for anything particular?" he asked. "I'm not sure," she replied. "Just browsing." She wandered between shelves worn from years of hands, sliding books in and out. She wasn't expecting to find anything. But then, one title caught her eye. A slim book with a faded cover. Quiet Miracles. Personal accounts of the unexplained in American churches. She hesitated, her heart tightening with a subtle thread of apprehension. She reached for it. The moment her fingers touched the spine, a faint shiver ran up her arm, an involuntary reaction she couldn't explain. She frowned, attributing it to the cold. She opened the book, flipping slowly through the pages. Inside were stories, late-night experiences in sanctuaries, whispered voices when no one was present, confessions heard by priests who hadn't served in years. Accounts varied in detail, but shared a single undercurrent, a moment of deep emotional need answered by something unexpected. One section was highlighted in yellow, the ink faded. She began reading. Sometimes the presence we meet in the quiet places is not meant to frighten us, but to reach us in the language our pain understands. Faith does not always come as doctrine or ritual. Sometimes it arrives gently, through memory, through voice, through a moment of recognition that feels like being seen after years of invisibility. Her breath caught. The page continued. These moments do not claim to break the rules of the natural world. Instead, they illuminate the places where grief, memory, and the sacred intersect, where healing becomes possible in forms we do not expect. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the book. Her pulse quickened. She didn't believe in coincidence, not anymore, not after the last 24 hours. But she knew the universe had a way of nudging in whispers rather than shouts, and this felt like one of those whispers. She closed the book gently and carried it to the counter. The man smiled as she approached. "That's an interesting choice. Not many people pick that one." "Have you read it?" she asked. He nodded. "Years ago. Some of the accounts are surprising. Others are comforting, depending on what you're looking for." "What do you think they are?" she asked softly. "Hallucinations, memories, something else?" The man paused, studying her with eyes that held their own quiet stories. "I think some things defy the categories we try to put them in. Pain has its own language, so does faith. Sometimes they meet in the same place." A subtle chill passed through her, but not the kind that made her want to step back. It was the kind that made her feel acknowledged. Later that night, Evelyn sat on her couch with the book open in her lap, a single lamp illuminating the pages. The wind outside pressed against the windows, echoing faintly through the walls. She read line after line, absorbing stories that mirrored her own in ways she hadn't anticipated. Moments in churches, late-night encounters, voices that seemed to know things no stranger should. Each story unsettled her, but not because of fear, because of the possibility they carried. Near the end of the book, she found a section that made her hands still. Some say the presence they encountered felt familiar, like a memory they had forgotten, or a voice they once knew, as though what met them in the quiet was not a stranger but a part of their own story returning to them. Her breath slowed. Her sister, the confession, the priest who called her by name. Something in her chest tightened, not painfully, but with the weight of a realization she wasn't ready to articulate. Not yet. But one question rose unmistakably. What if last night wasn't about the church at all? What if it was about her? And why did she feel, for the first time in years, that she wasn't entirely alone? The night pressed against her windows like a quiet witness as Evelyn sat cross-legged on the living room floor, the book resting open in front of her. She had read dozens of pages, yet her eyes kept returning to a single line, one that felt less like an explanation and more like a mirror. A presence that felt familiar, not familiar as in recognition, but familiar as in resonance, like the first few notes of a forgotten song rising from somewhere deep in memory. She closed the book softly and leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling as if answers might emerge from the cracks in the plaster. Her apartment felt different that evening, as though the air itself carried a hum she hadn't noticed before. The lamp in the corner cast a warm circle of light, but the edges of the room seemed to blend into shadow, creating a boundary between the world she knew and the world that suddenly felt larger than her explanations could hold. She wrapped her arms around herself, not out of fear, but out of the need to feel something tangible, something she could prove real. The memory of the confessional pressed against her thoughts again, the soft timbre of the priest's voice, the quiet authority in his reassurance, the way he spoke her name with a familiarity that made her chest ache. She had spent years trying to bury sorrow beneath routine, to hide grief behind productivity. But that voice had reached into the part of her she never let anyone see, not even herself. And that was what unsettled her more than the impossibility of the encounter, the precision of it, the accuracy, the intimacy. She stood and moved toward the kitchen, needing water, motion, anything to interrupt the looping thoughts. As she reached for a glass, she felt it, the faintest shift of air behind her, like someone walking past with careful, deliberate steps. She turned sharply. Nothing. Only the dim outline of her living room and the shadows stretching across the walls. Her breath quickened, but not from fear, from recognition. The sensation wasn't cold or threatening. It was the same quiet warmth she had felt in the booth the night before. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. "I'm imagining things," she whispered, though the words felt unconvincing even as they left her lips. She returned to the living room and sank onto the couch. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from her friend Mara, one of the few people in her life who still checked on her without being asked. "Thinking of you tonight. Call me if you want company." Evelyn typed back quickly. "Thank you. I'll be okay." The lie settled uneasily on her tongue. She set the phone aside and closed her eyes, pressing her palms against her knees. Her thoughts drifted, not deliberately, but as if guided, toward the last day she saw her sister. The half-hearted smile she'd given. The promise to visit that she hadn't kept, the guilt that now felt stitched into every breath she took. She tried to remember her sister's voice clearly, but all that came was the echo of the priest's words. "Love lingers. It finds its way." Her throat tightened. She needed answers. When the church bells chimed outside, faint, distant yet unmistakable, she opened her eyes. It was late, far too late for the bells to sound. She checked the clock. 11:14. Saint. Bridget's bells didn't ring past 8. She knew that. Everyone knew that. She stood slowly, as if pulled forward by an invisible thread. Minutes later, she was in her car, driving down the long stretch of Harper Avenue, the road illuminated only by the rhythmic pattern of streetlights. The cold seemed to deepen as she neared the church, as though the air had stilled in anticipation. When she parked along the curb, the building rose before her like a dark monument, silent, tall, its stone walls absorbing whatever light touched them. The front doors were closed, locked, as they should be, but Evelyn didn't come for the sanctuary. Not yet. She walked around the side of the church, her steps crunching through fallen leaves, her breath visible in small clouds. A faint light glowed behind the stained-glass window near the office wing, not bright, just a soft amber glow, pulsing gently, as though the room itself was breathing. She hesitated before approaching. Something in her chest fluttered. Fear, hope, or something in between. She pressed her hand lightly against the cold window pane, peering inside. The office was empty, papers neatly stacked, chairs pushed in. Nothing unusual, nothing alive. The faint light came from a lamp on a small side table which shouldn't have been on. She pulled her hand away slowly. When she turned back toward the main entrance, she froze. The confessional light was on. A single warm glow illuminated the booth through the narrow stained-glass sliver on the right wing of the church. Evelyn's breath caught. The air around her grew still, the cold folding into silence. She stepped closer, her heartbeat loud enough that she could feel it pulsing at her throat. The light flickered once, just enough to make her doubt whether she was seeing it correctly. Then she heard it, the faintest whisper, not words, not breath, just presence. Her knees weakened, not from terror, from something else, something like recognition, woven with longing. She reached the doors, her hand trembling as she wrapped her fingers around the handle. Locked. She exhaled shakily. A locked door should have been a comfort, proof that her mind was playing tricks on her. But the warmth radiating from the large wooden door told a different story. Churches held cold in their bones at night. This one felt recently touched, recently disturbed. She turned, scanning the dark around her. Leaves rustled faintly. A branch creaked overhead. The night air pressed against her ears, amplifying every sound. Then the confessional light flickered again. Just once, like a heartbeat. Then it steadied. Evelyn stepped back, her breath trembling. Her grief, her guilt, her unanswered questions, none of it explained why she felt drawn to that booth, as if some unresolved thread tethered her to it. She lifted her hand toward the stained-glass window, touching the cold surface again. The moment her fingers met the glass, a warmth pulsed through it, soft, subtle, unmistakable. She gasped and pulled back. The warmth lingered on her fingertips. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, startling her. She answered instinctively. "Mara," she said, startled by the quiver in her voice. "Are you okay?" Mara asked. "You sounded strange in your message." Evelyn swallowed. "I'm at St. Brigid's." "At this hour? Why?" She hesitated. "The confessional light is on." Silence. Then Mara's voice softened with concern. "Evelyn, no one is there. Go home, please." Evelyn closed her eyes, feeling the night deepen around her. "I just need to know," she whispered. "Know what?" But Evelyn couldn't answer. Because even she didn't know whether she was seeking truth, or forgiveness, or something deeper that had waited far longer than she realized. Before she could speak again, she heard it, faint, through the glass. That same voice, the same gentle timbre. "Evelyn." Her heart stopped. Mara's voice tightened on the phone. "Evelyn?" What was that? Evelyn's hand trembled as she pressed her palm to the window. "Something I can't explain," she whispered. And the confessional light, as if responding to her presence, flickered once more before returning to a steady, unwavering glow. The word lingered in the air long after the echo faded. Not loud, not forceful, just present. A presence that reached her not through her ears, but through something deeper, something that felt like memory and recognition woven together. Evelyn stood frozen, her fingertips still pressed lightly against the cold stained-glass window, her breath suspended in her chest. She didn't know how long she remained there. Seconds, minutes. Time had begun to loosen its grip the moment she heard the voice. On the phone, Mara had gone silent, the kind of silence that comes when fear steals words. When she spoke again, her voice was unsteady. "Evelyn, please tell me that was just someone walking by." "It wasn't," Evelyn said, her own voice a low tremor. It sounded like... She stopped, as if saying the name aloud would make the night shift in some irreversible way. "Like who?" Mara pressed. Evelyn swallowed. "Father Declan." Another silence, another breath between worlds. "Evelyn," Mara whispered. "He's—" "I know," Evelyn said. "I know he's gone." Her breath fogged the glass as she leaned her forehead against it, the cold seeping into her skin. The church stood before her, silent except for the faint hum of distant traffic and the rustling of the night wind. And yet the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt occupied, observed. Not watched in a sinister sense, watched in the way a parent watches a child, taking a hesitant step back into a place of truth. Mara spoke again, softer. "Come home. You don't have to do this alone." Evelyn closed her eyes. "I don't think I've ever done it anything but alone." The confession that wasn't a confession had cracked something open in her, a vulnerability she'd buried beneath years of guilt. But something else too, an awareness. As if the booth had stirred a part of her that refused to remain silent now that it had been acknowledged. She lowered the phone and whispered, "I'll call you later." Then she hung up before Mara could protest. The night wind brushed against her coat as she circled back toward the main doors of the church. She wasn't expecting them to open, but she needed to try. Her hand wrapped around the iron handle, pulling. Locked. She tried the second door. Locked as well. She stepped back, her breath uneven. Then she froze. Inside the church, behind the narrow stained-glass window, a shadow shifted. Not a full movement, not a figure crossing the aisle, just the soft displacement of light, like someone taking a step deeper into the sanctuary. Her heartbeat fluttered, fear mixing with an inexplicable calm, forming something she couldn't name. She pressed her palm against the door, the cold stabilizing her thoughts. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. The question dissipated into the night, unanswered. She turned back toward the sidewalk, intending to leave, when something caught her eye, a small shape resting near the old stone stairs leading to the side entrance. She approached cautiously, the gravel cracking softly beneath her shoes. The object was half covered in fallen leaves, the soft glow from a nearby lamp illuminating its edges. A rosary, old, darkened by time, its crucifix worn smooth. She knelt, her breath trembling, and lifted it carefully. It felt heavier than she expected, as though more than metal was woven into it. She traced the cross with her thumb, a warmth rising beneath her skin that contrasted sharply with the November air. Somewhere in her memory, a memory she didn't know she possessed, a faint image flickered, a hand larger than hers, a voice soft but resolute. A moment from childhood, perhaps, or a recollection buried so deeply she couldn't confirm its origin. She blinked, the image dissolving before she could grasp it. She tightened her grip around the rosary. The confessional light flickered again. This time it didn't settle, it pulsed, in slow, rhythmic intervals, soft, warm, almost like a heartbeat echoing through the thick stone walls. A surge of emotion moved through her chest, catching her off guard. She stepped toward the window, her fingers grazing the glass again. The warmth she'd felt earlier returned, stronger this time, as if something behind that thin barrier recognized her touch. Her voice cracked when she whispered, "Why me?" No answer came, yet somehow she felt heard. She pulled the rosary against her chest and stepped back, her thoughts racing. She couldn't stay outside anymore, not with the weight of the night pressing so heavily, not with the unanswered presence circling her grief like something patient, something waiting. When she reached her car, she paused with her hand on the door handle. Leaving felt wrong. Running felt worse. But going inside was impossible. She was suspended in the in-between, caught between the world she understood and the one that kept brushing quietly against her ribs. As she stood there, her phone lit up again, this time with a voicemail. She hadn't heard it ring. She pressed play, expecting Mara. Instead, a soft hum filled her car's speakers, a low rustling sound. The faint echo of something like breath, and then Evelyn. Her blood ran cold, not with fear, with recognition. It was the same voice from the booth. She listened again, replaying the message, her pulse quickening as she leaned closer. No caller ID, no number, no origin. Just a timestamp, 11:27 p.m., the exact minute she touched the stained glass window. Her hands trembled as she pressed the phone against her chest, the rosary still warm in her other hand. She closed her eyes, the weight of the night pressing into her. She didn't want to imagine what she feared. She didn't want to assume what her heart already suspected. But she knew, deep inside, beneath grief and doubt and the fragile logic she kept trying to hold on to, that something was reaching for her, not to frighten, not to haunt, to call. She opened her eyes, a new stillness settling into her bones. Not the stillness of resignation, the stillness of understanding. She whispered into the night, "If you want me to listen, then show me where to start." The confessional light, the one that shouldn't have been on, the one that pulsed like a quiet echo of someone long gone, went dark. A single blink, a final flicker, then nothing, and that silence felt like an answer. Evelyn returned to St. Bridget's at dawn. The sky was still the pale grey of early morning, the cold sharper than the night before, the air thin with a quiet that seemed to stretch across the empty streets. Frost coated the fallen leaves, turning them brittle beneath her shoes as she walked. The church stood in stillness, its stone walls absorbing the faint light rising over the rooftops. For the first time, she felt neither fear nor hesitation. Only inevitability, the gentle pull of something that had been waiting in the quiet long before she ever stepped into the confessional booth. She held the rosary tightly in her hand. Its metal felt warmer now, as though it had taken on the temperature of her pulse. She approached the main entrance and paused. The doors were still locked, but she wasn't here to force her way inside. Not anymore. She was here to listen, to understand. A soft crunch sounded behind her. She turned, expecting to see a passerby, maybe an early morning jogger. Instead, Father Jonathan, the current parish priest, stood a few feet away, his breath misting in the cold air. He looked tired, though not from lack of sleep. It was the kind of tiredness that comes from sensing something unusual and not knowing how to hold it. "Ms. Marrow," he said gently. "You're here early." She nodded. "I needed to come." He stepped closer, studying her expression with the cautious concern of someone who had witnessed grief enough times to recognize its shapes. "The secretary called me last night," he said. "She mentioned something happened." Evelyn swallowed. "Something is happening." Father Jonathan said nothing, waiting. She lifted the rosary slightly. "Do you recognize this?" His eyes widened. "Where did you find that?" "Near the side entrance," she said softly. "Last night." He exhaled slowly, the fog of his breath drifting between them. "That belonged to Father Declan." Evelyn tightened her grip around the rosary. "He spoke to me." Father Jonathan didn't flinch. Not immediately. His gaze lowered, and he crossed his arms tightly as the morning breeze swept through the church courtyard. "I believe you," he said. The words struck her harder than she expected. She hadn't realized how much resistance she was prepared to face, how much disbelief she'd braced herself for, and yet his acceptance came not as surprise, but as relief, like a quiet truth finally acknowledged by someone strong enough to say it aloud. He gestured toward a small bench near the side of the church. "Please, sit with me." They sat in silence for a moment, the cold stone beneath them grounding their thoughts. "Father Declan," he began slowly, "was a good man, kind, patient. People trusted him. He was the type of priest who carried people's grief as though it were part of his ministry. Sometimes I think he loved too deeply, deeper than he knew how to release." Evelyn looked down at the rosary resting between her fingers. "You knew him?" "Only through stories," he admitted. "He passed long before I was assigned here, but parishioners still talk about him. They say he had a way of speaking to people that made them feel known." Evelyn's breath grew tight. "He called me by name." Father Jonathan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let her words settle between them the way truth settles when spoken softly, without expectation. "You said something else happened," he said. "Something last night." Evelyn nodded. She told him everything. The voice at the booth, the warmth through the stained glass window, the voicemail with no number, no origin, the confessional light that pulsed as though responding to her presence. Father Jonathan listened without interruption, his hands clasped, his gaze steady. When she finished, he drew a slow breath. "You're not the first person to hear a voice in that confessional," he said quietly. Evelyn's heartbeat quickened. "Others?" He nodded. "Over the years. Not many, but enough that the pattern is impossible to ignore. Always late at night, always people carrying something heavy, and always the same description, an older priest with an Irish accent." "Father Declan," she whispered. "Or something of him," Father Jonathan said, "something that remains." They sat again in silence, but it was a different kind now. Not confusion, not fear, something contemplative, something that felt like standing at the edge of understanding, close enough to sense its shape, but too human to grasp its full contours. "I don't think he's haunting this place," Father Jonathan said softly. "There's no fear in the stories, no distress, only guidance, comfort. People speak of leaving the confessional with clarity they couldn't find anywhere else. Maybe trauma has its own ways of being seen. Maybe grief has its own language. And maybe—" He paused. "Faith does too." Evelyn's eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall. Something inside her loosened, not the guilt, not fully, but its grip, its sharpness. The wound softened, as though the presence she encountered had pressed a hand gently over it. "I spent 2 years believing I failed my sister," she whispered. "You didn't," Father Jonathan said. "No one's last moment defines their life, or their love." She bowed her head, a long breath escaping her chest. "Why me? Why now?" He looked toward the church walls, the morning light beginning to warm the stone. "Maybe because you asked, without knowing you were asking. Maybe because you were finally quiet enough to hear what's been waiting. Or maybe because your grief found a voice it recognized." A soft breeze brushed her hair. The world felt still again. She closed her fingers around the rosary, lifting it to her chest. The warmth surged once more, gentle, steady, unmistakable. Not supernatural, not provable, but deeply, intimately real. "What do I do now?" she asked. Father Jonathan smiled faintly. "Live, remember, forgive yourself, and if the quiet ever calls again, listen." Evelyn exhaled, a tremor leaving her bones. She rose from the bench and looked toward the confessional window. The light inside remained off, silent, still. But she no longer needed it to be on. Some presences didn't need illumination to be felt. She stepped back toward her car, pausing once to glance over her shoulder. The church doors reflected the growing morning light, and in that reflection she saw not the building, but her own faint silhouette, standing steady, waiting for nothing and welcoming everything. As she opened her car door, a soft breeze swept through the courtyard, and from somewhere, impossible to locate, she heard it again. Not a voice, not a whisper, just a quiet settling inside her chest, a gentle echo. Love lingers, it finds its way. This time she didn't flinch. She nodded once, a tear finally falling, but softly, without the sharpness of regret. Then she drove forward into the daylight, carrying a truth no record would ever hold, but one she knew would stay with her for the rest of her life. A truth that didn't demand belief, only acknowledgement. A truth that didn't ask her to understand, only to heal. And in the quiet that followed, she finally did.